I think, man, what we've assembled in the first three discussion groups, and actually also with our principal speakers, speaks for itself. I think you've seen nothing but ACEs experts. I'm proud to say that in our next session, you are going to see nothing but experts as well. And I'm delighted with Shelby. She was supposed to introduce Ms. Ambassador Stefanishina. They traded places with Ambassador Herbst, but I'm just very delighted that she is willing to take this session and moderate. So one and two, again, you see the list. It speaks for itself between Alexander Motyl, Robert McConnell, Paul Goebel, Olha Sydii, and Sydii, and Diane Francis, all experts in their fields. And then stay tuned. I'm asking you, stay tuned. There are not going to be any coffee breaks. The last session is perhaps the sort of culmination of all this. What we're going to have is a fireside chat between someone who has always been important in Washington, that is Herman Perchner, and the featured speaker, James Bazan, who happens to be also the shadow defense minister of Canada, which means that if need be, after an election of some sort, and so that very quickly, James would be running the defense industry. He's out of the Conservative Party, and he has an interesting message to give us here in Washington. So with that, those two sessions, I'm going to pass this session to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. And thank you so much for including me and for accommodating the swap. No better person to swap with than Ambassador Herbst, and he swapped so he could go talk to the Hill about Ukraine. So for good reason. But I'm thrilled to be here today with such a wonderful panel in person and online. And I agree, it's been all ACES, so hopefully we keep it up. I want to start with just setting the scene a little bit, because Bob and I were just saying this is quite a topic, and I think a great one. So this panel is an established national identity, assessing Ukraine's progress and regress. And I'm so glad that we have one of our panelists joining us from Ukraine for this. But just before we dive over into our panelist presentations, I want to say, while we will examine Ukraine's national identity and how it has evolved and strengthened in the face of Russia's ongoing aggression, we'll look at several key dimensions of national identity. Ukraine's sense of a common past, sense of a common present, its ability to forge unity out of plurality, ability to overcome the devastating effects of war, capacity to achieve a Euro-Atlantic future. And while together these themes help us understand not only how Ukrainians see themselves today, also how they envision their country's future, and I think how we can all be a part of supporting that effort. We talked about that on some of the other panels as well. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge something about one of the concepts that will likely arise during this discussion, and it's come up in some of my side discussions as well, and that's the topic of resilience. I know it's been discussed already today, but it has become in some ways bittersweet and even controversial term in conversations about Ukraine. There's no question that Ukrainians have demonstrated extraordinary resilience throughout the war, but I've heard, and I'm sure it's been expressed here as well, many Ukrainians have also expressed discomfort with the rhetoric of resilience when it's used in ways that can minimize suffering, normalize sacrifice, or obscure the immense human cost of this conflict and war. That perspective is valid. Challenge me if you disagree. But I want to share one thing that I heard when I was in Ukraine just a few weeks ago at a prayer breakfast in Odessa. A member of parliament captured the sentiment powerfully. He said that people often describe Ukrainians as being made of steel, and they appreciate that, but truly Ukrainians are made of flesh and blood like all other humans. And so behind every story of endurance are individuals, families, communities, lives that have been profoundly affected by war. National identity is a huge part of that, and our speakers can all touch that in the different ways. And so they're falling over, but so to our virtual speakers, you just tipped on the iPad, but we still have you. And so with that, I'll turn it to our panelists to touch on these different aspects of Ukraine's national identity. And the end, we'll get a report card. So be ready to see where the progress or any regress is. And so Professor Motyl, if I have you, I'd love to start with you. your thoughts on Ukraine's established national identity.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be as brief as possible since we have such a large array of excellent speakers. And I'd like to make 3 points that intersect some of the points that you made and some of the assignments that stand before us. The first is a point that I've made a number of times at this conference, and it's obvious and it's not original, but I do think it bears repeating, namely that wars are nation builders. That's a terrible thing to be. That's a terrible thing. One would prefer nations to be the product of reasoned thought, enthusiastic passion, and things like that. But in effect, wars play a very important role in forcing people, and again, I use that word consciously, in forcing people to choose sides. Until the war broke out in 2022, arguably until 2014, one could have sat on the barricade and not taking part in any discussion regarding one's identity. One could have been Russian, one could have been Ukrainian, one could have been a Ukrainian Russian, a Russian Ukrainian. One could ultimately say that I don't care who I am. Well, Putin has made that impossible. You're either on one side of the barricade or the other side. You're either with us or against us. And again, that may or may not be a good thing, but it's a reality. And the reality has had the effect of leading to a consolidation of Ukrainian identity, and in some instances to the formation of a Ukrainian identity amongst those people who lacked one, and those who had a Ukrainian identity, their identity has arguably been consolidated. So as terrible as the war is, and it is of course a terrible thing, it has had this one very important, very significant, and to my mind, long-lasting consequence, namely the consolidation of Ukrainian identity. I'd like to make 2 more points. One is, the second one, or the first one rather, is this. Due to the fact that the war is such an overwhelming ontological presence in Ukraine, in the feelings Ukrainians have about themselves, about their past, their present, their future, I'm going to suggest, if you like, I'm going to predict that once the war ends, and it will of course end, and I personally believe that it's going to end with the Ukrainian victory, but that's my third point. Once the war ends, the war will become the core leitmotif of the Ukrainian national narrative. What's striking about that narrative, I mean, it's been in existence arguably since the 40s, 50s, perhaps even since the 20s, and before that, but certainly in the time that the an independent Ukraine has existed, it's been very difficult for people, writers, poets, academics, policymakers, and others, to form and fashion a coherent identity, a coherent national narrative. People emphasize different things for good reason. I mean, there's no reason why people should agree. But the war and its overwhelming presence in the lives of so many Ukrainians, of all Ukrainians, the price that Ukrainians have paid for what I believe will be victory, does mean that the war will serve as that, as I said, that leitmotif, the core element of the Ukrainian national narrative, arguably for a long time, certainly for a generation or two. That's good. It's going to serve, I mean, on the one hand, it will be a reminder to people of the horrors of war, and that's always a lesson that one needs to be reminded of. But at the same time, it will remind Ukrainians of the fact that they did survive, that they were resilient, that they actually won. And one of the striking things about Ukraine's national narratives, as I'm sure all of you know, is that they tend to be focused on defeats. Kievan Rus was overwhelmed by the Mongols. Mazeppa lost at Poltava. Khmelnytsky was ultimately defeated. World War I was a chaotic catastrophe. World War II was no better. Here, I think Ukrainians will be able to deal with something very different, namely a victory. And that victory will serve, as I said, as this kind of anchoring element within the emerging Ukrainian narrative, which of course will have important consequences for Ukrainian identity. Final point is this. I do believe that Ukraine will win. And by that, I don't just mean survive. I've been arguing for 4 years that survival is a victory and stalemate is even more of a victory. But I do think Ukraine is actually going to win. Will it reconquer all of its territories? I don't know. But I do believe that it's going to win this conflict, this war, in a way that qualifies as more than merely surviving and more than simply achieving a stalemate. What that means, and you can see elements of this already, what that means is that Ukrainians will have reason to be proud of their identity. There's been a lot of, I mean, one noticed this in the literature, in the proclamations, even in the national hymn. You know, Ukraine is not yet dead. I mean, there's a kind of glorification of victim status. And of course, given the fact that Ukrainians have lost so many battles, that's perfectly understandable. But this will give Ukrainians an opportunity. I mean, the war and the victory in the war will give Ukrainians the opportunity to move from victim to hero and heroine, which I think is going to be a fundamental shift, will produce a fundamental shift in the way Ukrainians think about themselves. But it would also lead to a fundamental shift in the way Ukrainians behave vis-a-vis their partners and other neighbors. You know, for the last 30 or so years, many Ukrainians, certainly many Ukrainian policymakers, have approached the West with hat in hand. After the victory, they won't need to do that. They're not doing that already. I mean, one senses that they've developed a backbone, that they know who they are, that they are actually worth something, that they don't need to beg for assistance, they can demand it. So we're going to see a different Ukraine, a Ukraine that's going to consider itself to be the equal of the Europeans. I think that's a good thing. I think it's obviously a good thing for the Ukrainians, but it's also a good thing for the Europeans, since they will finally be able to shed their feelings of superiority vis-a-vis East Europeans in general and Ukrainians in particular. And I'll end on that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. I hope you could hear the clapping in the room. Great points, and I welcome our other panelists' reflections on that as well. But now I want to turn to Robert McConnell, and I especially interested in your thoughts on this move from victim to hero. But Bob, you first encountered Ukraine in the 70s, and when you think about Ukraine of today, what changes in the country's sense of identity, purpose, and nationhood strike you as the most significant, both in Ukraine and in the diaspora?
Well, my perspective is one from being here in the United States, a non-Ukrainian. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, a good part of it, if Ukraine was mentioned, even mentioned, it was because they were anti-Semite. That was what was in the newspapers, if it was mentioned at all. Period. I met a number of people who were Ukrainian, who, if the average American asked them, "Oh, you're from Russia," they wouldn't argue with it because it would take too long to go into that argument. As some of you know, Nadia McConnell, Nadia Komorninsky, she was not like that. She was always a proud Ukrainian, taking on professors in college, and they dared say, "Oh, they're just little Russians." But things have obviously changed. When RUP was formed, the movement, we started hearing things in the United States. What's going on? What's happening? Rook sent Mikhailo Horin to Washington in 1990. He was the vice chairman of Rook. This would be, by the way, his 96th birthday today if he were alive. He and the leaders of Rook, and he especially, I still have yet to see a Ukrainian with greater strategic thinking. When he came to Washington, it was very hard to get appointments because this was an opposition leader, blah, blah, blah. But we got him into many cabinet members and so forth, and he changed people's minds because he told them who Ukraine was, what Ukraine wanted, and it had a number of people starting to change. Now, as in 90, in 91, when the articles started coming out that Ukraine might break free, other countries have broken free. What did you hear in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times? If Ukraine tries to break from the Soviet Union, there will be bloodshed. There will be nuclear chaos. This is something we don't want to happen. George Bush's Chicken Kiev speech, suicidal nationalism. But what happened on December 1st? By the way, that's the day of independence. December 1st, 1990. 93% of the people in Ukraine voted for independence. High majorities in every region of Ukraine. And for the next many years, they were building their democracy, their country. People were starting to learn about Ukraine. And then in 2014, Vladimir Putin decided it was time for Ukraine to fight its war of independence. And I don't know how many times speaking across the country, people would say, why are they doing what they're doing? They're facing the Russians. How can they be doing this? And what were they doing? In my mind, I reminded my audiences, we Americans hadn't fought for independence for 200 years. We hadn't had a war. The people that were fighting in Ukraine had lived under the Soviet Union or were first generations. They knew that you had to whisper at dinner, that you had shortages. If you wanted to go to church, you had to go off in some place in the woods because it wasn't allowed. They knew what they were fighting for. We had forgotten. But they're fighting for it in front of the world. And now, because of the war and because of their successes, people are saying, who are these people? Who are these people? Well, now it's starting to come out. America and other places are starting to realize, yes, Gagarin was the first man in space, but how did he get there? The father of the Soviet space program was Ukrainian. When our first heavy lift rockets, nobody realizes this, were made in Ukraine for our space program. The talent, the capabilities are on display for the whole world. Drones ahead of everyone else. Ukraine is changed. Everybody knows Ukraine and Ukrainian people. That's what's changed. I'll leave it at there.
That's a great ending point. And if I could take moderator's prerogative, I just want to add, as a Jewish American of Eastern European descent, I'm glad you mentioned that. And it's something that I do think overall the narrative has shifted, but occasionally the questions of anti-Semitism still come up. And so when I'm asked about that, as someone who's not Ukrainian, but is regularly in Ukraine, I just point people to hear from the rabbis, the chief rabbis of Ukraine, listen to them, see them, religious Jews fighting in the army, and then recently I took a group to the Jewish cemetery in Odessa, which had been hit by Russian drones 3 times. And so point to that. And so I think it has overall changed, but still the work of everyone here in responding to that is important. Enough with me. Do we have Paul online? Okay. All right. Well then, okay. Oh yeah, I would love to turn to you and hear your perspective on all of this. And as I was saying earlier, your organization's name is a perfect fit, Ukrainian Voice. And so, you know, tell us what the Ukrainian Voice is, and let's assess the identity and how it may be changing. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Thank you very much, actually, to bringing the question of national identity into the table, because when we were discussing and listening to previous panel discussion and wondering how strong Ukraine is, how can Ukraine conquer the biggest military country in the world? How can Ukraine overcome the devastating effects of the war? We find the answer in the fundamental thing, which is our strongest asset, strategy asset of a country, the national identity. And when we look at the national identity in its core, and Ukrainian national identity, it finds its roots in the values, in democratic values of human rights, dignity, freedom, and at the same time, rule of law. When we look back into Ukrainian history, and I'm thanking you for bringing this also into the table, and I'm thanking our People's Deputy, Mr. Volodymyr, for also sharing the experience of how the propaganda machine was working against Ukraine all this time. And nevertheless, today, Ukrainian history is again fighting for its truth, but with a weapon in our hands. When we look at Ukrainian phenomena, we are also asking, how is it possible that the nation is going through this kind of a struggle? Why they are having this struggle for independence? I'm traveling around the world right now with the advocacy campaigns, talking about Ukrainian democratic values, talking about Ukraine defending democratic values, talking about the consequences to the water resources, to the environment, talking about the 350 years of continuous struggle for independence, for freedom, for democratic values, and people are asking me about the phenomena of Ukraine. And I'm explaining them, yes, we are a nation of the millennium history. We are a nation in which Princess Olha was ruling the country and establishing education and legislation long before in Europe, elsewhere in the world, the female leadership was recognized. We are the nation which was able to resist the Motyl invasion, to nation able to build the democratic values within Cossacks era. In the United States, we are visiting with the advocacy campaign and a book of Ukrainian lawyer, political activist, who in 19,000 wrote about independent Ukraine. It's a fundamental work which raised up generations of young Ukrainians to fight for their freedom. He was explaining how is it even possible that we have suppressed culture, that we cannot speak our own language, that books cannot be published in Ukrainian. And it was 126 years ago. We have translated this work into English, and we have a goal to translate it to United Nations languages and go around the world and explaining to key decision makers the phenomena of Ukraine, which lays in its history. And at the same time, I want to also say about the Ukrainian ability to conquer those consequences of the war we have right now, and at the same time, why it's possible. And today we were mentioning the unmanned systems, we were mentioning the drone industry. And I also have an honor to show you the patch of the first military voluntary unit who in 2022, in June 2022, were first to use the FPV drone kamikaze and target our enemy. And this is something what we were relying on in 2024 and 2025, the unmanned systems and the military opportunities, military production that we are capable to make ourselves. Because Ukrainians have seen in history that there are times when your friends, your allies around the world close eyes that someone decides that your nation does not have a right to exist. And I had an honor to be in Lithuania on the Congress of Mercy last week. And it was my first time in Vilnius, and I was impressed how by the Lithuanian flag, how by the European Union flag, there is also a flag of Ukraine and Belarus. And today, when we talk about forging unity out of plurality, it's important to talk that we have unity within Ukrainians. We are building stronger unity within Ukrainians in Ukraine and abroad. And a big thanks to Ukrainian diaspora working so hard throughout all these decades to advocate the right of Ukraine. And it was so inspiring to see in another country, in Vilnius, the solidarity of a nation on each of the institutional buildings, businesses, residential buildings, our flag. And I can tell that Ukrainian flag today is a flag of safety, a flag which marks a safe territory, a flag which marks there is a freedom of speech, a flag that marks there is a freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of consciousness, as the Organization for Defense for Freedoms of Ukraine declares. And nowadays, it's important also to talk about our ability to go through the Euro-Atlantic integration. And I can convince you that it's already embedded in Ukrainian society, but at the same time, it's also written in our constitution. It cannot be changed. And civil society in Ukraine is working their best to make possible to go through the legislation processes, reforms as quick as we can. We are becoming giving our shoulder of civil society to the government to be able to go through the Euro integration. And it's also important to mention the great support we have from our partners in the humanitarian intervention and also the early recovery. And today, when we are looking at this war, we understand that this is not a war of 12 years, as Michalski was writing. It's already a war of 350 years. And when I'm asked, do you think the war is ending this year or next year? I'm laughing as Volodymyr Zaryckyj is. It's the question, what we call war. Yes, today is a Russian war against Ukraine, but killing Chernobyl, killing Ukrainian dissidents and poets during the Cold War, was it war against Ukraine? Yes, it was. Forbidding Ukrainian language at school, was it war? Yes, it was a hybrid war. And at the same time, when we are standing on this momentum of the history, it's very important to form unity of the democratic world and give Ukrainian people and Ukrainian youth and Ukrainian leaders from the civil society to stand up and to fight the worst enemy in the world we could ever imagine, as we are the ones who are standing in the age of light and darkness. Thank you.
Your organization has a very fitting name, as I think you are a great voice for Ukraine. So thank you for that.
I will add a note that we as UA Voice, we form an alliance of NGO sector in Ukraine. And our mission is to Ukraine voice to resound loudly. This is what we are doing every day.
Thank you for that. All right, Diane, I'd love to turn to you for your thoughts on this topic.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. Excellent remarks. As people know, I'm not Ukrainian, not even an ounce of Ukrainian blood, but I grew up in the US, immigrated to Canada, and have a lot of friends among the Canadian diaspora, which is enormously successful and punches way above its weight economically in every aspect. So I became interested and I learned about the customs and the food and the culture and became a journalist. And when independence came along, I was over there right away to cover the story. And so I've been back and forth to Ukraine dozens of times as an outsider and looking at it as one of the most incredible geopolitical historical journeys in the modern era. And you know, it's really quite phenomenal. Now, in 1991, it was obvious that they were orphaned. They didn't know capitalism. They didn't know democracy, but Kravchuk was president. He was a good person. He tried, and then the next president was a bad guy. And then the backsliding into corruption and Russian style government and oligarchy and crooked elections and bribery seemed to take root again. And I think this got the Ukrainian public very concerned about all of this. And I think what's interesting is that the Ukrainians, from the ground up, joined forces in favor of joining Europe rather than being pulled back into Russia because of values and also because of safety. And then the world saw two incredible street revolutions, gigantic revolutions, because even though the Soviet Union had been brutal for ages against Ukraine and all the other countries, Ukrainians, probably because of their personalities, their churches, their agrarian roots, stuck together and had the most coherent, cohesive, powerful civil society in the former Soviet Union. And by going on the streets and having their revolutions, and they joined forces, and then the rest, of course, is history, because all of this was fighting corruption and crooked elections. But by 1997, the first truly free election was staged. Zelensky won, and the Russians said, we've had enough of this. And the rest, of course, now we see unravel in this awful war. Another thing I noticed as an outsider coming there to cover the political situation, I'm also a business writer, and I realized and met the most brilliant technology people. I've spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley that I'd spent since I've been to Silicon Valley. The educational level, the education of females, the quality of the education, the emphasis in schools of hard sciences and hard maths made it very obvious to me there was a talent base in the country that was amazing. And I got involved in a software business with some of these Ukrainian geniuses, and there were lots of them, and I wrote about them. It was an extraordinary thing. And of course, that brings us now to the war. And the unity, the incredible unity of Ukrainian people, the unique ability to join forces without being forced to, go on streets, make changes, fend off all of this, now leads us to being attacked by the enemy and mustering the forces of probably the most I think it is the most educated country in all of Europe. But certainly the most technologically advanced country, perhaps in the world. It was the Silicon Valley. It was the Manhattan Project. The atom bomb for Russia was invented and developed in Ukraine, the aerospace industry, the aviation industry. And so all of these brains, and Zelensky became president. His father was a famous computer scientist. And Zelensky was the first leader in history to appoint a minister of digital warfare. And the result is that they've taken their brains and overcome their weaknesses in manpower and in weaponry and reinvented warfare. They have essentially turned their war into a video game, and they are winning. They're also suffering, but it is an incredible story. I mean, it's a miraculous story. But now what do we have? We have a country that's been extremely damaged by this. Unified, yes. Amazingly unified and collaborative. But, you know, the biggest number of deaths in a war or refugees since the Second World War. And, you know, there's millions of Ukrainians that are mostly women and children that are not living in Ukraine. Now what will happen is this war will end. I hope sooner rather than later, but I don't have a crystal ball. But clearly, the world is working hard to bankrupt Russia and drive out Putin, who's a monster. And, you know, it's important to know that even though all this is going on, I really feel, and so do Ukrainians, that they're going to pull it together. And it's interesting that Europe has come through with helping pay for the weapons the Americans didn't want to anymore and so on. But, you know, it's today, despite all these awful problems, the European Union agreed to admit Ukraine into the first stage of membership. So the Maidan won. Ukraine will be part of Europe. And that brings me to tears. So what happens next? There will be some kind of stoppage, and the diaspora and Ukrainians will pull together and rebuild their country. And the country will also prosper because Ukraine has, I think, shown to the world how talented it is, that it will become partners with its allies instead of dependents of its allies. And so I'm extremely optimistic, and I hope we're at the beginning of the end. So those are my remarks.
Can you hear them clapping for you? Okay, good. Thank you so much, Diane. And I just want to also applaud all of your writing for years, bringing the stories about Ukraine to international audiences. So thank you for that. Do we have Paul online? Okay. All right. Olya, I'd like to turn to you on one of the trickier aspects of this. It was just mentioned by Diane. There are millions of Ukrainians abroad. Also, there are different experiences within Ukraine, of course, those in the armed forces, those in different regions. I'd like to ask your thoughts on how the different experiences throughout the war impact the sense of national identity.
When we think about national identity, it's thank you for this question. It's very important to understand that it was always a target of Russian war against Ukraine. And every time they were trying to spread diversity among the society and make us conquer East and West, in the military, not in the military. Family staying in Ukraine, family left Ukraine. And I can say that this is something what the aggressor was using for decades, also during the Cold War, also talking about the people who left Ukraine during the Soviet time and people who were staying in Ukraine. And of course, each sense of living is impacting the national identity. But the most important thing is that Ukrainians still able to find unity, even though of all these issues that might appear because of different backgrounds people come from. And I can say that the thing which is making us more friendlier every time is waking up after the sleepless night of the rocket attacks in Kyiv is something when you remind yourself there is no place for argument. And today, as was mentioned also about Urina, the consequences of the informational warfare. And nowadays, Telegram is also an instrument of Russian propaganda, of spreading news and disinformation, spreading and making the artificial conflict between civil society, volunteers, people in the military, people are not in the military, people who are mobilizing people for the military. There are a lot of things to get better in Ukraine. Of course, being a post-Soviet country for such a long time and fighting oligarchs, fighting corruption is a challenge. Lots of things to get done. We rely on Ukrainian youth, Ukrainian leadership on that. Thanks for your US Department of State, we have a Future Leaders Exchange Program as a program for leaders from post-Soviet countries. But answering to your question, it influences national identity, but not that much to hit it and have bad consequences for nowadays.
Thank you very much. Professor Motyl, I'd welcome your thoughts on that question as well.
Well, look, in every nation, at whichever time in history or today, you will find a multiplicity of views on politics, religion, society, economics, and so on. I mean, every nation, even the Swiss, who are always viewed as being homogeneous, is heterogeneous. Diversity is part and parcel of every nation, of every collective, of every group. What the war does, or at least what the war is doing and will continue to do, this in any case is my suggestion, is it provides a unifying theme. I called it a leitmotif. You can call it anything you like, but it's a unifying theme, something that is so obviously important to every single person in the nation, in the country, that it will frame identity and induce people to pursue a certain kind of narrative style. I'm not suggesting that this will be the case forever, but a generation or two, possibly longer, is certainly very possible. I mean, if you look at British literature in the aftermath of World War I, or German literature, or American literature, a lot of it was framed by the experience of the war, and that contributed to the development of these various national narratives. In the case of the British and the Americans, arguably good narratives. In the case of the Germans, unfortunately, bad narratives. But nevertheless, a narrative of some kind was able to emerge. One sees the same thing in American films regarding World War II. There's always John Wayne leading the charge on some obscure island in the middle of the Pacific. Well, that leads to a certain consolidation of views regarding what the narrative should be, what the narrative is, and how it has an impact on identity. And so I suspect that, exactly the same is taking place within Ukraine. Ukraine will remain deeply heterogeneous and deeply, profoundly diverse. It has been that way since time immemorial, arguably. And there's absolutely no reason to think that that will change. But possibly for the first time in its history, or maybe not, but in any case, possibly for the first time in its history, it will have this single dominant unifying narrative. And I think that'll lead to the consolidation of the identity, and with regard to some people, to the formation of an identity, but it's going to have a lasting impact on how Ukrainians think about themselves and how they think about the world around them.
Thank you very much. Diane, I'll turn to you. You mentioned a lot about the international audiences, and I know you write for them and share all these stories so powerfully. Do you think that the international audiences fully appreciate how much Ukrainian society has changed? And are there aspects that are still misunderstood? Bob spoke on some of them, but I'd welcome your thoughts too, especially if you're seeing this in Canada.
Well, I think that I don't think there's anyone in the world who's educated and updated on the situation who doesn't respect and admire Ukraine. This is the underdog of underdogs. And, you know, you see this in American polling, you see this in polling everywhere. And, you know, everybody understands how awful Russia is to its people, to anyone, and how it unjustifiably, without provocation, you know, sent tanks and raped and pillaged this nice country that hadn't done a thing to it. And so it's clearly, you know, got a good reputation among the world, among people who are educated and informed. This will be helpful going forward. And you know, I've got to think that's got to be helpful to Ukrainians too, to know that people understand that they're victims here and that you know, they're making great sacrifices and so on. So I think that you know, the shall we say, the identity of being a Ukrainian has been propelled upwards quite dramatically around the world, and it should be.
Thank you very much. Bob, I'm going to turn to you on maybe a trickier one. I never want to center Russia in these discussions, but as Diane mentioned, Russia's crimes, and much of the world has seen this. You've been following Ukraine and Russia in Washington for a long time, and I'd welcome your thoughts on how the view of Russian identity, understanding of Russia as a state, has changed over time, where it's at, and if more work is needed on that topic.
Well, that's an interesting one. One thing comes to mind during our conversations is been in Washington a long time, been here during the Soviet days and the post-Soviet days. The Russian lobbying and influencing peddling and propaganda in this city far outstrips what it was during the Soviet time. And that their primary target in all of that is Ukraine. I mean, it's to diminish Ukraine. It's not doing it. It's not doing it. The people of Ukraine are making their own history here in Washington. People see who they are, what they are. The history of Ukraine is coming out. A lot of things that were subscribed to Russians were not Russians, they're Ukrainians. You know, it's staggering how much is coming out, given how little was known before. You know, the subject of religion came up before, and I'm glad you added what you added, because I have some stories too, but I won't go to the Jewish part of it. How many wars in this world right now are based on religion? Many of them, and conflicts beyond just war. But about 5 years ago, we, the US-Ukraine Foundation, had a conference in the Capitol. And one of the panels in the afternoon had to do with the subject. And who was on the podium? Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian Catholics, Protestants, Jews, muftis. They all sat together. Now, this is obviously the Russian Orthodox was not listening to Moscow. And they said, I mean, I remember Rabbi Bly saying, we don't talk religion. I mean, if he's right, I'm wrong. If I'm right, he's wrong. We don't talk about that. But we work together. We need humanitarian aid. And if we get some, but it's needed in this region, and they have a better pipeline to that region. We give it to them and they get. We cooperate as institutions. I don't know of any country that could have had a panel like that discussing things the way they were. I just have to give one historical story about Ukrainians have always been proud. In 1966, back then, there were USSR track meets every year. 1 year was in the Soviet Union, 1 year was in the United States. In 1966, on ABC's Wide World of Sports, Jim McKay was introducing the winner and the world record holder at the time of the 100-meter dash. I'm here with Valery Bortsov, the great Russian sprinter. Bortsov said, I am not Russian. I am Ukrainian, and walked off the stage. Well, he was standing up for his country. And I mean, over time, over and over, Ukrainians have always been proud, even when they couldn't talk about or people wouldn't listen to them talk about. That has changed. That is changing. The history, when the US-Ukraine Foundation set up our first office, it was still the Soviet Union. And we set up a local organization, the Philip Orlik Institute for Democracy. Why? Because Philip Orlik established a constitution with separation of powers and all the things that we think are so proud long before the United States did. He was a powerful figure. He needs to be known. His contributions need to be known. And we need to remember the airport in Paris is the Orly Airport.
Thank you. Diane or Professor Motyl, any thoughts on that and the changing views of both Ukraine and Russia? Diane, you look ready.
Well, there's no more confusion. There really wasn't any differentiation. The names started the same, and the diaspora was not that large compared to, say, the Polish or the Irish diasporas. And, you know, I think that the story now has come out because of the war. Russia's always been just, you know, a problem for everybody for decades and always will be. And so it gets no sympathy. And, you know, many people, I mean, I was at a concert recently and a group of us walked out because there was a Russian concert master in the orchestra, after many of us have said they shouldn't be there. And he hadn't signed anything saying he was disenchanted with the war. You know, the Olympics, the World Cup, all these things, they should be banned and they should be shamed. It's also important, though, however, to remember that Russia is not full of Russians. The culprits that have perpetuated all this suffering and imperial stuff are really Slavs who live in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they live very high off the hog. And they snack off a 11 time zone country that's filled with 140 different ethnic groups, and they deserve to be liberated and hopefully will be.
Oh, there's clapping. You got a reaction in the room.
That would be great if Paul was here to talk about the ethnics. Yeah.
Okay. Professor, do you want to add on that?
I would just add the following. 40 or so years ago, when I got into this business, and I completed my dissertation in 1984, the so-called Soviet nationality question, which incorporated the non-Russians and, of course, Ukraine, was something that was done by a handful of scholars in the United States and Canada, who would occasionally meet, have coffee, and kvetch about the fact that no one's listening to them. I remember attending a conference in 1987, so this is already perestroika and glasnost, I was a newly baked PhD, surrounded by all these very impressive Sovietologists. One of them made some remarks about something or other, I forget exactly what. And I piped in and said something about, well, one needs to consider the importance to this issue of the non-Russians. At which point he turned to me with this acidic smile on his face and said, Alex, the non-Russians don't matter. And that was the view amongst very, very many people, certainly journalists, policymakers, academics who should have known better 30, 40, certainly more than that years ago. Well, that's changed completely. It changed for a whole bunch of reasons. One, of course, was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was to a large degree the product of non-Russian mobilization. It's collapsed as a result of Russian imperialism. It's collapsed as a result of non-Russian resistance. It's collapsed as a result of Ukraine's wars with Russia, and so on and so forth. So we are now in the position where, thanks to the burgeoning academic and policymaking interest in Ukraine, regardless of the war, but also, of course, due to the war, we're in a position where, of night and day. Yes, there's still a lot of work to be done. Yes, there are people who still disagree, but that's always going to be the case. But 40, 50 years ago, Ukraine, as a number of you have pointed out, simply did not exist. Now it does. And it does more than just exist. It's actually existing in a very important fashion. And that is night and day. And I find that encouraging, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was actually going to ask you to talk about the changes you're seeing in academia and if more needs to be done, as we were talking about reclaiming some of these narratives. What is Ukrainian? But so you're saying, if you could give a report card on just that, you're saying there is progress, but more needs to be done?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would say it's an A or an A minus or something like that, but it's really very impressive. I taught a course last semester at the Harriman Institute at Columbia on Ukraine. First of all, the mere fact of a course on Ukraine at Columbia University, it wouldn't have happened, it's 40 years ago, but here we have a course. There were 15 or so students in attendance, 3 of whom had a Ukrainian background. The other 12 had no interest in Ukraine other than the fact that it was a fascinating country that was geopolitically important, and it happened to be of relevance to their interests. None of that would have been the case 30 years ago. Today, Ukraine matters in all sorts of ways, not just because it's a nice country with nice people, but also because economically, politically, strategically, militarily, it's important. And people, again, it's taken a while for people to appreciate that, but I think at this point in time, they do. Even those who don't like Ukraine have recognize that it exists.
Thank you very much. And I believe Diane has to leave. So Diane, thank you so much. All right. I'd like to turn to the audience. I have more questions, but if you have questions, Walter caught me first. So if question, comment, concern, yes.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, and I'm hoping that Diane was still on, but I can direct it to all of the speakers because they all brought this up. My issue is that you have seen, and Diane was the one that brought it up, but I've heard it from Alex, I've heard it from Robert, and from Olya, and actually from you, Shelby. There seems to have been real progress in terms of our national identity and who we are, and the values, Olya, the values of freedom that we've had it historically. You're literally Ruska Pravda onto Orlik, onto all these things. I mean, the fact is that we've had that tradition. Isn't it strange that the global South has not fully understood that we're part of national liberation, that we, like the Irish and the Polish men, had to fight a lot as Europeans. Not just, it wasn't just the third world, or it was in Europe. you had 300-year-old animosities. And they haven't really seen that we are part of a national, that we were part of a national liberation struggle. And so therefore their votes in the UN and other places have tended to be sort of connected back to the old Soviet, the Soviet Union, a friend of all the, nations on their imperial, whatever. And the other side is that the Ukrainians, they must be doing something wrong. So what can we do? Because that's a very important part of the world, the global South. What can we do to have an impact on them and have them begin to react, including this latest thing with Lavrov? It's in the UNESCO, and yet I don't hear a lot of noise from anybody. Okay. Sorry.
Walter, was at a conference last August in Prague where this came up at a significant degree. And what was coming out of what I had not ever referenced anything the global South before, but anyway, what came out of that was that Russia is spending enormous amounts of money in Africa. It dominates the news in Africa, and in Africa, it is a war. The war that we talk about is a war between Russia and the United States and colonial Europe. It's not seen as a war against Ukraine. It's seen as a war against colonial powers and the United States. That is because they dominate the news. We have left that news. We've vacated, we've left the vacuum there that they have filled very, very well.
Did you want to add on that?
Yes, I would like to add. Thank you. I think that Volodymyr's question was also about what can we do about it, and media is an answer about that. So digital communications, which we can try to foster out there. And when we are talking about the global South, it's also important to understand that they are already affected by the propaganda, and it will be very hard to conquer the efforts Russians are doing. But it's something the whole democratic world should be thinking about, because as you see, they envision this war as already a world war. So it's not only a Ukrainian task to resolve, but definitely United States, Canada, Europe, to invest in a media there and invest in building local civil society networks. It's important just to take them into account. Think beyond the West.
Thank you. Professor, did you want to add on that?
I know far too little about the global South and its attitudes to be able to say anything of importance. But the one thing that does occur to me is that whatever efforts are directed at the so-called global South should be directed at most one, possibly two countries that matter above all else. The diaspora, and certainly Ukraine, as well as the United States and Europe, just don't have the resources to address this issue in 20, 30, 40, or 50 countries. It's just not going to work. And the country that comes to mind as being perhaps most open, well, first of all, being very influential, being a great power, and being most open possibly to some kind of persuasion would be India. If India could be, or at least if some Indians could be persuaded that they need to think differently about the war and about Ukraine, that might make far more of a difference than if one or two people throughout the entire global South are affected by these messages.
Thank you. I'll ask the mic to go over to this gentleman over here, but I do want to add something briefly first. I think the UN is a whole other can of worms worth discussing, but on sharing and media and narrative, I want to actually mention a report that came out recently by FIDH, Truth Hounds, and a bunch of other organizations. And the reason it's relevant is that it's talking about, it's called Combatants, Mercenaries, or Victims of Human Trafficking, Russia's Exploitation of Foreign Fighters in its War Against Ukraine. And there's some very interesting stories and great work being done around the world, including in Africa, including in South America, about Russia human trafficking, exploiting, tricking people into being in the army, and there are groups speaking out around the world, including mothers saying, "Where are our sons?" And so I think Russia's hurting their own image around the world too. And I think sharing those stories will be helpful. All right, now over to you.
Thank you. I have one important notice.
Please introduce
About-
yourself as well.
Volodymyr Petrovich. It's about Ukrainian national identity. I think that the changes in Ukrainian national identity have certainly been accelerated by the war. But however, they were not caused by it. The foundation of this transformation was laid in civic initiative in early 1990s. They first became part of state policy after Orange Revolution and were further institutionalized between 2014-2029. The full-scale Russian invasion renewed this policy as state priority and made it far more widely accepted by Ukrainian society. As a result, we are now witnessing changing that would have been difficult to imagine just a decade ago. The use of Ukrainian language has expanded dramatically. A majority of Ukrainians now recognize soldiers of Ukrainian insurgent army as fighters for Ukraine's independence. Thousands have also distanced themselves from Russian Orthodox Church and joined to Ukrainian Church instead. So the war is not creating a new identity from scratch. Rather, is reinforcing and accelerating a process that have been underway for decades, making visible transformations that were already deeply rooted in our Ukrainian society. Thank you.
Thank you. So more of a comment than a question, I think. Okay, we'll turn over there. And please introduce yourself with a question.
Hi, I'm Wayne Murray. I'm American Foreign Policy Council. Before that, I was in the Foreign Service. And early in my career, I was assigned to go to Ukraine, where we did not have a diplomatic post yet, but we were going to open a consulate there in 1980, and I was going to be the #2 officer. Then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the administration decided not to open a consulate. So I didn't go there. So I went to Moscow, but I spent most of the next 3 years traveling around Ukraine and other non-Soviet countries within the Soviet Union. And I remember one day at lunch, one of my colleagues who worked on arms control was basically ridiculing me because I was spending all my time on nationalities and religion, which were the subjects which really interested me, but which he pointed out were of no interest to anyone in Washington and which he thought was a waste of the taxpayers' money. It was Bill Courtney. At that time, Ambassador George Kennan, whom I got to know in graduate school, and I also knew in an embassy, not only had no interest in Ukraine, he really resisted anybody trying to engage him on the subject of Ukraine, like me. His daughter, Grace Kennan, went on not only to live in Ukraine for a number of years, but to become a leading American expert on Ukraine as a culture and as a society. I learned a very great deal from her, not about geopolitical stuff, but about the things that distinguish the civil society from the public sector in Ukraine and why those have become so important. I mention these things to show that mentalities in this city and in this government have changed a lot, but they have come out of a tradition that was really more based on American relations with pre-Soviet Russia, because there was a time when Russia was very popular in the United States because they had supported the Union during the Civil War, whereas the British and the French, of course, had supported the Confederacy. But with newly independent Ukraine, there was something that happened that I think is still a legacy. It was the development first for us in Europe, but came over into America, of a thing called Ukraine fatigue. It originated, I believe, in Germany, and it became a sense of impatience with this particular newly independent country. And when I went to work in the Pentagon in the mid-90s, where I was in charge of relations with Ukraine, among other countries, I noticed that Ukraine fatigue was very prevalent in much of the US government and in International Monetary Fund, UN, EU services. And I think some of that is still around. I think the last 4 years have largely purged the mentality of most of Western countries from that, for obvious reasons, but not all. I think much of it is still there in Germany.
Is there, sorry, question to end
No,
that? No, okay.
I'm coming to it, but people were asking earlier today why Russian propaganda about Ukraine has been so prevalent and so relatively successful. I think a large part of that is the legacy of the 1990s of Ukraine fatigue. How much of that is still left in Europe, I do not know. Here in America, I think hopefully practically none. But it was there. And it was part of newly independent Ukraine's stereotype and image. And some of that, I think, is probably still around. Because when I think back on how little George Kennan gave a damn about Ukraine, I think, there's all these other people here who are supposedly experts on that part of the world. I wonder.
Thank you very much. Okay, question? Okay, quick question.
Katerina Odarchenko, hello, thank you for this issue. I just want to ask you, so if it will be something like after war, new, I don't know, something national, like federalist paper in Ukraine, you know, about this national identity, and who must create that? Because we write also with Atlantic Council a lot of articles that still, like, when we go to sociological reports, people not trust a lot, like parliament or cabinet of minister. So who will be people who will create this national idea, like religious leaders or, I don't know, community leaders or outside, I don't know. And what can be this, like, basic, maybe in one sentence, national idea? Is it like that we all believe in God, or it's based more on history, or more, maybe more on economy? Because like now on last report of rating group, I see that Ukrainians understand even European Union more as an economic partner, but Ukraine have values which correlate, but, you know, so maybe it's economy idea. Maybe we can, you know, form this in one sentence. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that is a tricky question, and I'm going to give that to you, Olya.
Yeah, I'm just writing it down, the national idea, and it's a challenge to word it up in one sentence and represent your country in Washington, D.C. and say this is a national idea. It's important to understand when we are talking about the national identity that it's not something we agree on June 17th or something what will appear again after the wartime. So the national identity, as was also mentioned by our People's Deputy, Mr. Volodymyr, is deepen in Ukrainian roots, and all the struggles we are going through is also shaping this national identity. And when the war comes to the end with the Ukrainian victory, because there is no other way of the resolvement of this war, is either we win or either the fight continues. There will be an election. There will be, again, a communication on the media, in the society, what is a priority for Ukraine, what is on the table today. But at the same time, I believe that our people will remain thinking and keep in their mind, in their memories, that the first priority is Ukraine. Ukraine comes first. Ukrainian interests comes first. And the national identity it was formulated in the last century by Ukrainian and insurgent army, by Ukrainian nationalists, and it's also something what is transforming in today's life. It's independent, sovereign Ukraine, which is able to be rich and happy. That's it. This is all we are thinking and all we will be working on, what we are working on nowadays, and definitely it's a priority after the war.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that's a great note to end on. And now I will ask our panelists to give their grade on this topic. So for the report card, we've got 5 or A representing serious progress, C, no change, F, real regress. So Professor Motyl, I'd like to start with you. What is your grade? You are muted.
I'd give Ukraine an A.
We always like to hear that from a professor. Okay. All right, Bob.
I'm going to give 2 grades because she asked me a question about Russia and I didn't really answer it. So Ukraine gets an A, and Russia has come, its name now should be based on the abducted children and the genocide war it is conducting. It gets an F.
You don't often hear clapping for an F. Okay. Olha, end with you.
Yeah, we need to quote that. And yeah, I definitely give a strong A, strong progress, and it's also now confirmed by the research of the national identity made in 2025. 96% of Ukrainians are proud to be Ukrainians. And we can, I don't have the researches on the democratic countries in and the United States, but in 2000, there were 62% of Ukrainians proud of their national identity.
Wow.
And in 26 years, thanks to the enormous work of civil society, we were able to build this trust and build this solidarity and a common understanding of common past and common present in our society. And it's a big work.
That is a great point to end on. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. Diane, thank you.
What's their ethnic background?
Yeah, I don't have a present. This is a book, the Parliament of Independent Ukraine. It's in English, so I hope it's just 4 pages to read and to have it in your office. And this is attached to the second battalion, which were the first two.
I have one of these.
It's big one.
Yeah.
Amazing. I'll make a picture.
About 6 months ago.
We were visiting us.
All global disappearing
So
on
let's-
us and
let's
stuff
give
like
the
that.
floor
It's a
to
heartbreak.
Dimmer and the
Robert, we will continue to get re-invited on these things. Yaku, thank you. And Alexander, if you're still on. Is Alexander? He dropped off. I would have thanked him because he really did.
It would have been great to have Paul.
I was, I'd like to be able to, I think we need the 35 minutes on this last session. The last session is going to be.
Yes.
Christian. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we're starting. Yes. Herman, we're about to ask you.
It's okay if I take the microphone out?
Yeah. Perfect.
Been here, done that.
Mr. The very last session is actually a session I would have dreamed about and so on and so forth. And so I'm going to take 1 minute on this. Herman Perchner has been a mainstay of this entire process from the very beginning, in 2000 on. He and I worked on things since back in the 90s, actually late 80s. Yes. And so the fact is that I don't know if there's someone who is as connected as Herman is, despite the fact that he's relatively conservative in his politics. He's always played a bipartisan game, and that was always something that I admired about him. The person that he will be doing a fireside chat with is another person who, in fact, comes out of a country that understands bipartisanship in a very fundamental way. In fact, I think that Derek Fraser once said, "Jesus, I wish that it was like the old days in America, where we had Keating on one side and Javits on one side and someone else on the other, or McCain and Biden was the old story." And so I know you come out of conservative tradition, but I think you're here to give us a message from the Canadian conservatives on how you think, man, the West ought to conduct itself. And I think Herman and you discussing this, man, will be very, very important for all of us to, including the people online.
Well, thank you, Walter. It's always been a pleasure to work with you over the many decades. And I don't think I've ever been at one of these conferences with so many knowledgeable people where I didn't learn something. And I suspect everybody else that participates picks up a nugget here and there. I'm introducing James Bijan. Those of you that have looked at the program understand he was 8 times elected to the Parliament of Canada. He's been a chairman in the Parliament, a leader in the Parliament, a leader in his party. But what's maybe not mentioned in the official biography is he wasn't one of the politicians that just goes around collecting titles, but he's taken the time to really learn his brief, and that takes work and study over a lot of years to understand the intricacies of defense, but also to understand what's going on in other parts of the world. Tomorrow he'll be, or tonight actually, he flies to Europe for meetings with senior European officials. And that's especially apt given the title of the presentation, which I'll read. How can the West best help Ukraine achieve full sovereignty, stability, and prosperity? And I would like to add just a little bit to the end of that, which I think is apt. How can Ukraine help Europe obtain full stability and prosperity over a period of time? Because you have now this interdependence that is going to become tilted more towards European dependence on Ukraine than just the one-way relationship that was necessary early on in the war. So maybe I'll open up the discussion by asking you where you think the biggest value added is for the West trying to help Ukraine during this time of need.
Well, first of all, thanks, Herman. It's great to be able to share the stage with you. Known of you for a long time. We've met in the past, and so it's great to actually be here. I appreciate, Walter, the work that you've put together in just an incredible group of speakers and panelists. That has definitely, I think, for all of us online and those in the room, really look at all the different aspects of what's happening in Ukraine today, and what's happening around the world, and how that impacts on Ukraine and how Ukraine's impacting upon the entire world. I've spoke at this event, probably over a decade ago, and usually you get invited back either because you're, a good enough speaker and they want to hear from me again, or as Walter pointed out, and says, yeah, that wasn't that good. I'll give you a chance to make it better. So, I promise, Walter, I'll do better this time. When you look at the current state of affairs and listening to all the speakers today, and for all of us that follow Ukraine, the war effort in particular, know that they have the chance to put Russia on the back heel. And this is a time that the West really needs to show the political will and the resources to help Ukraine win. The only way this works out well for the West For those of us in the political parties, whether we're working bipartisanly here in the United States, we've been able to get to a multi-party dialogue and consensus in the Canadian Parliament. We currently have 5 parties in our Parliament, all supporting Ukraine and supporting our government and making sure that they continue to invest in the war effort, as well as into all the other programs that Ukraine needs at this point in time. But all of it is for naught if Ukraine doesn't win. A weakened Russia, Putin, who is completely ostracized by the West, means that Europe is safer. And Ukraine would have provided that with their own blood and treasure and ingenuity, as we're hearing now, in everything that they're done with modern warfare. We know that the Arctic becomes safer because the biggest threat that we have from continental security is Russians' incursions into, the Bering Strait, the Bering Sea, the Beaufort Sea, the Arctic Ocean, and Canada and the United States working hand in glove in ensuring that we protect North America, Fortress North America, from those Russian Bear bombers and occasionally Russian fighter jets that accompany them into or close to our air identification zones. So that is the way that we actually get to a resolution that allows the United States to worry about their other nemesis being Beijing. But that means that we have to continue to work hand in hand across party lines, across the alliances. It has to be more than just the coalition of the willing. The United States has to step up again in ensuring that the tools that are required and the dollars that it's going to take to finally push Russia and the barbarian invasion back across the border. And that only happens with strong consensus, consistency, and ensuring that through this process that we are unwavering in isolating the Putin regime, that we continue to sanction across the board, and that we use Russian foreign assets to actually help Ukraine win this war. And the forfeiture of those assets have to happen sooner than later. I have legislation in the Canadian House of Commons right now. It just came out of committee and last night that will actually put a timeline on how long Canada can sit on those frozen assets, that they have to be divested to whether it's in this case Ukraine, or whether it's assets that they're frozen in relation to the Iranian regime, but to the victim, so that they can actually use those dollars. And ultimately, with the concern is the American taxpayer. Yeah. They aren't going to be on the hook for it. It's actually using Russia's assets to defeat, their war machine and ensure that we, at the end of the day, get the peace and security Ukraine needs and the rest of us need as well. That also means that we continue in our isolation is we have to defund Russia's war machine. So Ukraine's been doing that through very targeted attacks on Russian oil and gas infrastructure. But that means that the West, we have to step up and supply Europe with the gas and oil needs. And Canada's been failing at that. We haven't been building the infrastructure and making sure that we get more, we're number 4 overall for natural gas production in the world, number 5 for oil, or number 3 for uranium production. Why aren't we sending more of that to Europe?
You've been traveling to Europe a long time. Over the last few years, do you find European resolve becoming more serious or less serious?
Well, again, we're all witnessing the political upheavals that are happening in various parliaments right now. What happens with Marine Le Pen in France, and does Macron hang on, and how is that going to ultimately impact upon France's ongoing support for Ukraine? Stammer in the UK right now is, he had his incomplete defense cabinet ministers and parliamentary secretaries all resign on him just in the last week or so. That again, it causes that internal instability that will impact upon their long-term success. So at the same time, I still feel most of the people within UK Parliament are still behind a strong Ukraine that will ultimately win this war. You know, there's been changes, definitely by having Orban out is good news. You know, was mentioned earlier, some of the conflict that's now arisen between Ukraine and Poland, but I think that can be overcome. That's historical context, and that let's think about the future. And Poland definitely has invested heavily in its military. It has been there to support Ukraine right from the start of the full-scale invasion. And we need to make sure that, you know, because of Putin, you know, NATO continue to get stronger. You know, the Baltics have been solid. And I know that although they're not big, powerful nations, they're prepared to fight because they know the danger in having, you know, Russia invade their area. And if you listen to the German general in charge of their Air Force earlier this week, he sent a very clear message to Moscow. You try to invade Europe, we will eliminate you. So, you know, that's the type of verbiage that we need, but we also have to back that up with action.
Thank you. Appreciate the fact you're talking about possible political changes in Europe. And we understand if there are political changes in Canada, you become Minister of Defense, which would be.
I serve at pleasure. You know, that's up to the Prime Minister if, when and if that happens for our party. But you know, I've been in government, I've been in opposition. I can tell you this: opposition sucks.
We had an Undersecretary of Defense during the Reagan administration by the name of Freddie Clay. He was a defense intellectual, and his most famous book probably is "Every War Must End." And at some time, the war will end between Ukraine and Russia. And could you comment a little bit about the role the West must play when the war ends?
Yeah, and I'm always reminded that all wars end at the negotiating table.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to first of all make sure everybody understands that, you know, signing any agreements with Putin in particular, but with Russia in general, mean nothing. We have this thing called the Budapest Memorandum, garbage. We have this thing called Minsk I, Minsk II, garbage. So the only way that we actually get to peace is that we have to get every square inch. If I was in Canada, I'd say every square centimeter, but get every square inch of Ukraine back as Ukrainian territory. That includes Crimea. Crimea is Ukraine. Luhansk is Ukraine. You know, Zaryckyj is Ukraine. Kherson is Ukraine. Donetsk is Ukraine. All that has to be back under Ukrainian sovereignty and their territorial integrity respected. You know, we're talking earlier, and I agree with our previous panel that was talking about the defense side of this. And I believe it was General Hodges that said that the only security guarantee that matters is Ukrainian membership in NATO. And we've been saying that for some time now in Canada, that we have to provide that membership because that ultimately is the only thing that matters in ensuring that Ukraine is no longer a target and Article 5 is in play. And we want to encourage the European Union to accept Ukraine under full membership. That also is a must for long-term prosperity of Ukraine.
I especially appreciate your comment that we can't trust Russia to keep its word in treaties. In the annex of one of my books, I listed all the treaties the U.S. had with the Soviet Union and Russia. And with the exception of things like postal delivery, they violated every one of them over decades. So what about the role of the West in helping Ukraine industry? We've talked a little bit about building up the defense industries that will rearm Europe as well as Ukraine. But what about other things like rare earth minerals that exist in Ukraine? Is there a role for the West in developing production of those rare earths and making us less dependent upon the supply chain from China?
Well, Ukraine has always been first and foremost the breadbasket of Europe. And that role will continue. You know, I come from a farming background, agricultural education, and I can tell you that I've always been impressed with the crops that I've always seen in Ukraine. I wish we could grow crops like that in Western Canada, but we can't. And I know that when my Guido in particular, when he immigrated in the first wave, came to Canada, he often, you know, busting up the prairies and trying to farm it. He would write these. He was actually fairly poetic and write these like long lamentations about how he missed his beloved Ukraine and the black earth and how easy it was to farm. And so, you know, you inherit that reading those stories and talking to my Guido. I know that when we really want to start thinking about long-term prosperity, so first and foremost, we have to rebuild that infrastructure. That in itself will create a lot of jobs. There's going to be a lot of steel and cement needed, and to partner in with Ukraine to do that. Although they have these incredible engineers that we all know about, they're a very well-educated society. Secondly, is we got to ensure that there's free trade agreements right across the board. That's why European integration, being next door, makes a lot of sense. You know, coming from Canada, knowing how important trade is with the United States in particular for us, and when you put those things into jeopardy, it impacts upon economies. So making sure there's that certainty of those long-term trade agreements, as well as those partnerships. And so everything that we have learned over the last 4 years, but really I say everything we've learned from 2014, is that Ukraine's ability to invest in their own ingenuity and the way that they've been able to adapt to the circumstances that they find themselves in, and to defeat, you know, what was supposed to be, you know, a superpower, it will be historic when this comes to an end. And all of us as allies have so much to learn, and it's going to be through that partnership of dealing with the new style of warfare and investments in each other's economies and sharing IP will make us all stronger, and will put the other members of the CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, on notice that we will not accept any more of their efforts to destabilize, you know, the Western free markets, free trading, and free peoples of the world.
I have a lot of other questions, but I want to give an opportunity to the audience, to people that may wish to ask a question. If not, I certainly have enough in reserve. There's one right here. I think Wayne Mary has one too.
It's going to be a question that was, but you could answer this question also. We would like your opinion on it. Well, we're talking about national identity. And we're talking about who Ukraine is, right? We never wanted an empire. We freed slaves and serfs in the Russian Empire, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Turkish Empire. And now we're still fighting for rights and freedoms. So how do we take this to the Russians, right? Because Miss Francis, your Canadian sister, she said that the power lies in Petersburg and Moscow, right? And the rest of the people are even suffering worse than the people on the Ukrainian front, possibly. So how do we do that? There was a project, I wanted to, Mr. Motyl was there, and Karatnitsky, I don't think Professor Zaryckyj was there, at the 2025 Shevchenko conference. And they were talking in New York at the Scientific Shevchenko Society. They were talking about Shevchenko's Russian language diary from his sentence. And they were going to publish this and drop it in hundreds of thousands over Russia. They talked about it 2 years ago. And is this something you think is good, taking our national identity? And how do we affect change in Russia? Thank you.
So, you know, I think Russia's ongoing nationalization of their identity and spreading it falsely throughout the Russian region, not just in Ukraine. We're talking about, you know, Walter and I were about a month ago in Toronto at an event that we did on the, well, they used to call themselves the anti-Bolshevik nations, but they are the anti-bloc nations now, and really saying, you know, if we can make Russia smaller again, make them just to be, you know, more of that Moscow, you know, St. Petersburg area, and allow the Caucasus and allow Manchuria and all these other areas to become independent, which would ultimately be better for the world. Definitely, when you think about Putin's, ongoing, rewriting a history and the people that support him in doing that, that false narrative has to be exposed. And so, Taras Shevchenko, is a national hero of Ukraine. And I often think about some of his poetry has inspired and maintained during, for over 200 years, maintained Ukrainian patriotism. My grandparents luckily left Ukraine before it fell to the Bolsheviks. So they didn't have, they were under Austrian rule when they came to Canada. But they left because they didn't want to be under Austrian rule, and they definitely wouldn't want to have been under Soviet rule either. And we kind of lost contact with during the Holodomor with some of the family. And so this is something that we started talking about back in the 70s and 80s in Canada, that we started erecting the monuments recognizing the Holodomor. I brought forward legislation to call it a genocide in 2008. And, we need to continue. We started, when I was a kid, we went always to the Ukrainian National Festival in Dauphin, Manitoba. We never missed it. I grew up going there all the time. So we were proud of our Ukrainian heritage. And so we did everything we could to continue to reach out to family in Ukraine to ensure that they were also still embracing, even during the 80s, at the end of the Cold War and that Soviet time, that they were still proud Ukrainians first and foremost, and protecting their language, protecting their culture and religion. Joseph Stalin failed to exterminate the Ukrainian culture. Vladimir Putin will fail as well.
And remember, in Canada, here's some is somewhere far away in Washington. In Manitoba, he's in front of the parliament.
Just a quick comment. We had an ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, 47 to 50, Beadle Smith, later our first CIA director. And when he wrote a book about his experience, the thing that he worried about the most was that they would believe their own propaganda. And the problem we have with the Russian population is, with brief periods, they've gotten nothing but the propaganda. So they believe even people that would be decent neighbors, if you found them in the US or Canada, simply have crazy ideas in their head. And from that flow policies that are going to be problems for us for a long time.
Yeah, thank you, Katerina Odarchenko. I want to ask about timeline in free type of fighting with Russia. Like you mentioned, military fight. Yeah, I'm not professional in that, but like how long and how many weapons Ukraine more needs to came back to 1991, because on J7, for me, it was like a little annoying idea that it's very long time war. And one more time, I don't understand anything in warfare. Second issue, it's in sanctions, right? To fight with economy of Russia with sanctions. But one more time, European Union do maybe better work with that. In United States, still these bills of Granholm and Blumenthal and sanctions, it's not moving. So what is timeline there? And third, ideological, like if to fight with their ideas, for example, in European Union, unfortunately, they're pretty successful in paying for pro-Russian political forces in every country, pro-Russian media, and they move their people to European Parliament. So also what is timeline and maybe efforts which international community can do, because if they move their members of parliament to European Parliament, they will block some decisions. So maybe you can explain to us some tools in all these sectors and timeline when we can expect some results. Thank you.
So on the information warfare that's taking place, we really need to do better on it. I can tell you, and this is where sometimes the bipartisan support becomes difficult because you have the far left and the far right are believing a lot of the Russian propaganda. So whenever I post on anything in support of Ukraine or against Russia, I get trolled hard. My staff just keep telling me, don't read your social media feed, but I can't help it. Anyway, you know, we have to do better. I look at Taiwan because they have an amazing information ministry, and they get out quickly. They identify as soon as the trolls and the bots are starting to promote stuff, whether it's on X or on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. As soon as things start to move, they identify it and quash it quickly. So their reach becomes almost nothing. So they're able to, they've empowered civil society to be their weapons on the ground to actually fight the social media warfare that's taking place. Unfortunately, that's not happening in Canada. It's not happening in the States. And that's why we see so many people that want to speak out in support of Ukraine back off, including some of my own colleagues, because every time they post anything or even share anything that I've shared, they get killed and online. And it's resonated enough though that I can actually identify people I know that are actually sharing or, you know, echoing the Russian trolls with complete false narratives. And you know, we talked earlier about how Putin loves to rewrite history. That revisionist history is getting played online, and we have to be out there, you know, and be just as aggressive as the Russians to correct that. Bureaucracies move too slow. That's where civil society, those of us as individuals, need to step up and push back, and to correct the record. On the sanctions, so my legislation that's going through right now does a number of things. One is, for the first time in Canada, we're defining what transnational repression is. We're also putting in legislation, prisoners of conscience, so that we can also stand up for them. But the transnational repressions that I guess the adversaries, those countries that are responsible for it, plus their proxies that they're using within our own countries, can be sanctioned as well. Often that's, you know, foreign students, it's people that are over on work visas, and they're getting intimidated by their own embassies that they have to do certain things. So that is important. And then I think that when we got 5 minutes, I think as we continue to move down the pipe on this, we need to ensure that the coordination between Europeans, North Americans, as well as, you know, Australia, New Zealand, other like-minded nations in the Pacific Asia, are working hand in glove in how we implement sanctions, the Magnitsky-style sanctions, because the more that we can go after not just governments, but those kleptocrats and oligarchs, and they know that there's a financial price to pay for supporting corrupt regimes like Putin, like Xi Jinping, that at the end of the day, they're going to be targeted, and then they aren't going to be able to enjoy their illicit wealth. And by doing that, we may actually prevent the next Putin, if they're going to be held to account, if they're going to be dragged in front of the International Criminal Court for stealing, you know, 28,000 children out of Mariupol and Donbass. That's what we have to do. They need to hold them to account for bombing Lavra, you know, in Kiev. We have to make sure that people, not just, you know, Putin and his inside circle, it has to be all those that enable him that also are targeted.
Last question to Walter.
I'm going to ask a question because we were at an event 2 weeks ago in Canada that dealt with it, and Diane Francis is here. I'm just sad that Paul Goebel wasn't here, and she's right, that he should have been here. The big question is that in the old days, even if you didn't want to actually announce that you wanted the solution of the Soviet Union, we had things like Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. We had a BBC situation. You had CBC doing the same. Broadcasting in the language of the nationalities, as Motyl used to call it, the nationalities question. Is it possible, Ben, that given the fact that there are major nationalities still stuck in something, as Coffee has said, that hasn't all disappeared, isn't it possible that new money can be found? And what a good project that would be, to have language, you know, broadcasts to, into the Buryata and the Chechena and the Dagestanci and the Cherkessia and so on and so forth. Because that would be one hell of a project. And you could say, look, we're not looking to dismantle, but we're looking to reach people, the indigenous peoples, if you want to call it that. And wouldn't that be something that Canada and the United States and Europe especially retry? Because that was a good project. I think it was very effective in the Cold War. That's my question.
And I agree with you. It breaks my heart when I've seen all those programs cut. And I know that more and more of the world continues to move online, but then we just adapt with it. That's how we deal with it. And it probably costs a lot less than what we were doing before. We just need to have the political will. And so when you get the political will, I'll close with this because I got the 2-minute mark. When you have the political will and you're able to overcome the party politics that surround it, then you have true leadership. And with that leadership, we can actually action these things that are important for a free, independent, and peaceful Ukraine, and to ensure that we can continue to target those that want to destabilize what we stand for: human rights, democracy, free trade, free markets.
I think that's the last word. So thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Walter, we're keeping you on time.
Who has been our communications director, Herman, and MP Pazan. I wanted to thank.
Don't forget your phone.
I just simply wanted to thank you. Shadow Minister, I wanted to thank you personally for making this trip. I know that. And Herman, I always thank. You've been the best week I know ever. Andrij, I think it's now your time to give us the official lowdown on how we've done this year and possibly compare it to some of the earlier. Okay. All right, let's wrap it up. Yeah.
All right, wrapping this up. We had a slightly more positive spin this year. Last year, actually, we had one of the worst grades that we've had at the summit during the even greater general security. So last year, our average for that panel was 3s, 3.5s. There were a couple of 1s and 2s. And boy, what a couple of drones do to change people's minds, right? I was at a anniversary of one of these dance groups I go to in upstate New York, and they're called Zaryckyj. And I was like, you should really change your name, because all we talk about in Ukraine, if you go to Oko, is the dronopod. And honestly, so that's the major change from last year. We had a lot of positivity as far as national identity last year, a lot of positivity as far as market economics and energy security. But really the main difference was even greater general security. So going through the list that we have on your grading sheet, and you can all mark those down for your posterity. This year we had a lot of A's and B minuses. I think overall we were at a A minus B plus for the first panel with graders. And last year we were at an average of 4 to 4.5. So I think last year I said it was 4.2 for the ending. Market economics last year, we gave all the panelists were closer to a 5 for effort, but 4 for reality. And this year we were 3 A's and 1 B, including a couple of A pluses. So I think overall we're at a 4.5 as opposed to a 4 last year. Security this year, again, last year we were at 3.5 as far as the average. This year, we were no less than a 4.5 across the board. So again, that's the major change from last year. And then well-established mature national identity. Last year, we were no person who gave grades was lower than a 4.5 last year. This year, we were all A's, 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 A's. And as we heard from Olha, 96% of Ukrainians call themselves proud. So I think even more so than we do at these conferences, we're seeing the reality on the ground in Ukraine. So that's a reality. As I mentioned last year, and we may have mentioned throughout the day, we have all of these recorded from 2019. So you can go back and actually see what Kurt Volker said, or what any number of advisors and government representatives have been saying for these grades. And you can actually see a really straight through line, especially with even that dip for security last year when everybody was really dejected. For those of us who travel to Ukraine, I think there's 3 of us who are all traveling to Ukraine this week. Am I me? And I saw Richard was traveling this week. Stephen, like it's a very big week to go over there this week. Oh, and there's also a congressional delegation right now with Sviridenko. So overall, you can take a look at these grades that I've just given you. You can compare them for every year going back to 2019, which are the ones we have recorded. But we also have the written version that Vlodko has for all 13 previous sessions. I'd like to finish up by thanking all of our wonderful organizations that put this together. As usual, for the Working Group Summit, it's not just the Center for US-Ukrainian Relations and the American Foreign Policy Council, but we also, as we normally do, have the International Republican Institute at the very beginning. We also have the National Democratic Institute and the Congressional Office for International Leadership, which some of you may remember as the Open World Institute, now rebranded for the last several years as that Congressional Office. And of course, we can't do anything without our wonderful patrons. This year, as every year, we have all these wonderful people come to Washington and attend this, have a nice meal in the morning and in the afternoon, all because of the generous donations of the Heritage Foundation of First Security Federal Savings Bank. We have our friends Self-Reliance Financial, which is in New York and Philadelphia now. We have Summa Federal Credit Union, headquartered in Yonkers, but also around the country. Our friends at the Vogue Foundation, the Nawrocky Torielli Family Charitable Fund, and our friends at Unique Print, who do a great job with our programs every year. So thank you very much for your attendance. We'll see you again next year. And please mark your calendars for our regular roundtable discussions, which will be happening in October. So we'll see you here in Washington in October, if not somewhere else before then. Thank you.